Well, I think all of us at some point in our life sort of wait to be discovered. We're hoping that someone will sort of just discover and notice our greatness. And maybe it's when you're very young that happened to you. Maybe you were one of the 6 billion kids on the soccer field on Saturday morning, and you were just certain that there were scouts out there in the crowd, and they were going to notice that you were the best at soccer. Or maybe it was a little later, maybe you were in school and you were just waiting for someone to come along and go, that truly is the best dinosaur eating a Volkswagen sketch I've never seen anything like that. You should be in a museum. Or maybe, it was a little later and you were hoping that someone would notice that you were the best at your Burger King job. You were like, you're the best fry cook we've ever seen. You should be, the head of sales and marketing at Burger King Corporation. You waited so many times. We wait in our lives, or maybe it's a little later, and we hope someone discovers us in our middle management position. And maybe that's happened to you. I don't know. Like maybe someone has discovered you at some point, but my guess is most of us are still sort of going through life and hoping or just waiting, like maybe someone will discover something about what I'm doing that is great, and then they'll notice and give me that promotion I've always dreamed of. But in the meantime, while we're waiting for someone to notice our brilliance and promote us, we're all sort of creating a resume, and it's the same for all of us. Although we're different, we might have different names, but we all have a name on our resume, and it's either a good name or a bad name. It's the name in your industry that sort of everyone knows, or, oh, we saw you on Cops, or, oh, are you that Don Record? Yeah, we saw your arrest warrant. No, that's not me, I'm just saying. But we all have this name, and it's on our resume, and we either hope they notice it or we hope they don't notice it. But all of us have to deal with that. And then we all have this sort of, and I know it used to be called career objective, maybe it's profile or whatever it is. We all have something in our life on our resume, just these few pages of information that define us, that is about like what we want to be or how we see ourselves. We're the one writing it, so we say, hi, I'm Don Record, I'm pastor, or I'm Don Record, I'm painter, or whatever you put on that, and we have that, and that sort of defines us. Then our education, we all have that. And maybe you've got great education. And you're like, man, I hope they get past my name, and I hope they get past sort of my objectives, and they see this great resume of education that I have. And then some of us are like, hey, I hope they skip right past that and go to work experience. But we're all creating this sort of short file. It's probably a PDF file on your laptop, or maybe it's up on monster.com right now. We could check it out. But we all have this. We have our work experience, and we sort of talk about ourselves in the best possible way and sort of magnify the great things that we've done and try to skip past that summer that we weren't employed, or that year we weren't employed, or wow, how did you have 2 jobs in 2 weeks? That had to be difficult. I've got a couple jobs. I think I'm still on break at a job in St. Louis, Missouri. I never showed back up. We have those things, and then finally we have our references, and if all else fails, we're like, well, I hope they get to my reference. I hope they actually call my references because I got some good ones. Or maybe you're like me, like, I hope they didn't call my references because I made that one up, Or some of you, I realized this week, I was like, some of people in this room have used me as a reference, and I don't know what you're thinking. I'll do it for you. Like, I'll write you that letter. But someone asked me for a reference for a seminary, and I was like, I hope they don't check that one. I'll recommend you, but they'll realize I've never even been inside a seminary. Can't even spell it. I'll use spell check. But it's funny, like, we hope and we pray, and now that should save me some time because not as many of you will ask me for a reference now, but I'll be glad to give it. But we have the reference, and we just all have this resume. And here's the thing I want to sort of talk about and zoom in on. We all sort of imagine, and maybe that we should be discovered, that someone should notice sort of the good work we do. And then we have this resume that we've created. And we sort of have 2 categories. We're either like, if people would just see my resume, it would help me. It would help me get that dream job. It would help me get that job in my field. It would help me get that raise I want. Or maybe you're here this morning, and I think there's a lot of us also that go, well, it's my resume that's holding me back. I could do more. I know there's something great inside me. I don't know what it is, or I just think that if they see my resume, they won't realize what I could do. And so we sort of have this two categories, like either our resume is holding us back from what we could be, or if someone would just notice it. But I want to add a third sort of category for you this morning, and I hope that we can sort of build on this over the next few weeks in this series as well, is that your resume matters to God. Like God knows your resume. This is not a threat. Not like he knows what you've been doing, seriously. And I do too, because I've been on Facebook. Not really. But like God knows your resume and cares about your resume. And I know this morning that sounds sort of weird. I mean, I totally get that you're like, I didn't expect to hear that at church. You know, like I expect you to talk about the Bible or spiritual things, or, you know, like I didn't come to church really to talk about my resume. I mean, I'm willing to talk about it, but it doesn't seem like it has anything to do with church, because that's spiritual or that's religion, and that's my job, my occupation, just something I do during the week. And I'm telling you this morning, and I hope I can create this third category, that God knows and God cares about that. Now, I know there's a couple reasons probably why you don't think that, and I know most of us don't think that. And I think there's a couple of reasons why you don't think that, and number one is preachers, and number two is the Bible. So let's deal with preachers first, because preachers are weird. And I would have told you last week, honestly, like I'm not like this, because as most of you know, I'm not paid here by Action Church. I actually work a job. I'm a painting contractor. So I would have told you, like, I'm not like most preachers, and I don't get so sort of geeked out about preaching stuff, and I don't think that's the only thing to do in the whole world. But I realized last week I'm as bad as anyone else, because someone told me this week, they're like, you really kind of went on and on and on about that Elisha guy, and it had nothing to do with this. And I was like, you're right. Like, Elisha's kind of a hero of mine, and I talked about him because I think it's awesome that he was like healing people and preaching, and he's kind of a hero of mine. So I realized I fall into that category. So as preachers, we're the guys talking about the Bible most of the time, and we think preaching is awesome, and we're the only ones. And so it's sort of just natural that everything we highlight, like the saying is, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you're a preacher, everything in the Bible looks like it's about preaching. So we only talk about like preaching and leadership and things like that. And you get the idea like, well, my job doesn't count, or my job's not in the Bible, or and so that's normal. I understand that. Like preachers talk about preaching, we talk about leadership, we talk about prayer, all these things that you go, well, that's nice because you get paid to do that. That's not my job. Now, the second reason you sort of feel like that, like God couldn't possibly care about my job or my resume or my background. And you kind of feel a disconnect. Most of us feel a disconnect between our day-to-day work and church and religion and God, is the Bible. And the reason why that is also is you have to realize that the Bible's not really a book. It's not a story. It's more like a bookshelf filled with stories. And it's written over thousands and thousands of years. And sort of the things that make it into that bookshelf are the great leaders, the great moments in history. And a lot of those tend to be pretty fantastic jobs. In fact, like if I could use Moses as an example. I was thinking about him. Like, we have a feeling when you read a story like Moses that, and preachers do this because we think preaching and leading and being a prophet's awesome. So we sort of tell it like this, that Moses is this guy, and he just happened to be like the, Pharaoh's stepson, because, and we talk about the miracle where Moses was found in the little boat floating down the river, and Pharaoh's daughter just happens to pick him up, and then he kills someone. If you know the story of Moses, and preachers love to talk about, he used to be a murderer. We have an ex-con leading the nation of Israel, and he was a shepherd for 40 years, and God likes to choose shepherds. So we sort of tell the story. If you look at Moses' resume, like he was a shepherd, and God shows up in a burning bush and says, I choose you. You're the guy. And Moses says, no, I stutter. And he's like, well, your brother could do it. But it's like, we tell the story like Moses just discovered out of nowhere. And so you and I, it sort of reinforces our feeling, I think, that like God chooses people or God discovers people, but my resume is totally separate from religion, from spirituality, from church stuff, whatever that is. Another one that we like to talk about, and this is another great resume, is the story of David. King David, his background is basically, bear killer. Well, he was a shepherd also. God does tend to hire from the shepherding field, but like he killed a bear, he killed a lion, he killed a giant, and he's a harpist, which those things, and I know I always imagine like the giant weird harp that you see like in an old restaurant. I don't think it was that. Probably more of a gunslinger guitarist in our world. But like it's just this story. We go, well, how did he become king? I mean, God just chose him. God just discovered him. And preachers say that. And it sort of reinforces that stereotype that our resumes are sort of separate from God. Now, I want to introduce you instead. I say all that to say this morning. I want to introduce you today to a guy that you probably haven't heard of, but you know his work. I'm really frustrated with his name. His name is Bezalel. Have you ever tried to type something like 150 times during a week that your spell check didn't like? My spell check wants to call him Bezels or Hazelnut. And after a while, I just gave up, and it's hazelnut. Like, all of my notes are like, I love the coffee. You can be hazelnut, because I'm tired of pushing that little X. And I know somebody's going to go, oh, you know what you can do? I don't care. Like, I'm annoyed with this whole process. Hopefully, it won't say hazelnut anywhere in the slides, because I'm pretty sure Kate took care of that. But Bezalel is a guy that I think matters because he's not sort of this fantastic leader, this spiritual giant, this guy that we've heard about in our bedtime stories as a baby if we were raised in a Christian home. Bezalel is actually interesting. He was born about 1400 BC. And he was a master craftsman. He was a craftsman in gold, in silver, bronze. We know that he was just like fantastically talented in mounting precious stones, did some weaving. Basically, he was just sort of this Renaissance artist who was a master of every trade. And what we know from that, if you think about building his resume, his education had to be, many years of apprenticeship. You don't become a master goldsmith or a master silversmith or a master sort of stone cutter overnight. You're never going to meet like a master goldsmith who's 19 years old. You might have great skill, and that's the thing to remember about a master craftsman. Obviously had skill and talent, but it also took years and years and years and years of work to sort of reach that master level. And that's what we know about him. I had the opportunity last week. Have you noticed, like, a lot of events that we do, I am supposed to pray, and I either forget or I wander away. I did the same thing. I was supposed to pray at a black belt graduation last weekend for my daughter's taekwondo school, and I managed to go there, wear a suit all day, was introduced as the guy going to give the prayer, and never gave the prayer. But anyway, that's sort of my thing. My future is hopefully in not praying at baseball games and not praying at NASCAR races. I think I found a niche that I can fit into of just not praying at different events. But anyway, the interesting thing about this event, besides watching my daughter, was the fact that they actually belted a 7th degree black belt, like a real deal 7th degree master. And I'll never see that again in my life. And the reason why, like, you can start your own Rex Kwando school and go, I'm a 19th degree whatever, and get a belt made. But this was actually from the Taekwondo Federation from Korea. They actually sent over the certificate from a guy who was there when Taekwondo was actually founded, like 90-some years old, who certified that this guy had been working for, I think, almost 40 years on his 7th degree master, grandmaster belt. And it was amazing to look at this guy who's in his 50s. He's the teacher of the school, the headmaster, and see what amazing shape he's in and amazing things he can do, but realize, like, he's been working toward that belt for 40 years. And that's a picture of what a master is. And that's the way you become a master goldsmith or a master. So we know that he spent years and years and years and years working on these skills. He had talent. He worked. In fact, I think it's Malcolm Gladwell that says 10,000 hours to become a master of anything. And I think that's true. There are certain things, like, we can have talent. We can find people who are super talented musicians, but it's going to take 10,000 hours before they're actual master of their art. And there's another interesting thing you should know about Bezalel is that he was born a slave. In fact, for most of his life, we know that he was a master goldsmith. He would have had to have been apprenticed and sort of enslaved by a very wealthy family, or perhaps royalty. We don't know for sure, but we know that, your average person didn't have a slave who would be a goldsmith. So probably for the pharaohs, he was enslaved in Egypt. Probably for the pharaohs, or at least some ruling family in ancient Egypt, spent most of his life. If you think your job isn't rewarding, imagine being the best at your job and working with these amazing materials and seeing like royalty wearing or having in their tombs the things you had built. But he was a slave who never sort of got to reap any of those benefits. Never went on that vacation, never drove the new car, never had the cool condo. All of the rewards we would think that would come from being a master, he really never experienced because Bezalel was a slave. Now, maybe you're guessing or looking ahead, or you can imagine this is a story from Exodus. So yes, Bezalel was actually freed as a slave later in his life. We don't know when, but we know it was late in his life. It was after he became a master craftsman. So this guy named Moses, who worked with sheep for 40 years, comes out of the desert, says, "Let my people go." You may have heard the story. You may have read the Veggie Tale. You may have seen the movie. But Moses comes along. The slaves are freed. And you might say, and I used to think, I was thinking about this, oh, that had to be awesome. Imagine, all of his life, he's just toiled away and gained his skill, and he had to think, this is never going to matter. He had to take some satisfaction maybe from the beautiful things he made, but to go, I'm never going to reap the benefits of my labor. But then one day he's a free slave, and he's freed into a roaming nomadic tribe who lives in tents in the deserts. Can you imagine that? It'd be like being amazing at code, and finally you're freed. I don't know if they have code slaves. They probably do somewhere. I don't even want to know about it. But you're freed, and you go out, and they're like, yeah, but we don't have computers or Wi-Fi. So so it's I was thinking you're a carpenter, or we don't have wood. It was they didn't have or weren't. It was you don't exactly set up a goldsmithing kiln and shop and forge in a tent in the desert as you wander through. And I was thinking how disappointing that had to be. If I put myself in a position to go, I have this skill that I've gained over years and years of my life. Most of my life I was a slave doing this, and now I'm a free man. But I don't think I'm going to be setting up a master goldsmith shop anytime soon as we wander aimlessly through the desert. But one day, here's where the story gets interesting, and we sort of see something amazing happen. One day, it's sort of like the story of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Not exactly, not will you guide my sleigh tonight, but one day Moses comes along and says, I've been on the mountain, and God gave me plans for sort of this mobile tabernacle. You've never even heard of a tabernacle, but imagine a temple that you can move. It was like a tent city, only it was made of gold and fine linen, and we'll be able to move it as we travel, but we're going to have a place to worship God. And he said, Bezalel, I want you to guide my sleigh. No, that's a different story, but I want you to make all the stuff. In fact, Exodus 36:2, it says, so Moses summoned Bezalel and Aholiab and all the others who were specially gifted by the Lord and were eager to get to work. And Moses gave them the materials donated by the people of Israel as sacred offerings for the completion of the sanctuary. Now, this story goes on, and I won't read it to you this morning, but it's interesting. The people of Israel were awesome because they asked for donations. They got so many donations for this project that they actually had to stop them. They're like, stop it. We've got too much. We'll not be able to use everything. And here's an example of, later on in this chapter, it says that they gave 2,193 pounds of gold for this project. At today's rate, even though gold is way down, $35.6 million in gold. 7,500 pounds of silver, which is like 1.6 million. It says that the bronze, which was very important at that time, because that's how you made your tools, and your bronze was super important at that time, and they gave so much bronze that it wasn't even weighed because it was too much. Now, you might wonder, how did the Israelites come up with this kind of loot? There's a story earlier when they left, kind of a side note, when they left Egypt, God told them, by the way, borrow some nice things from your neighbors and then leave tomorrow. And you might go, why? God's like telling them to rip off their neighbors. No, he was getting like some back wages for them. So they walked out of Israel when they left and crossed the Red Sea with thousands of pounds of gold and silver. So God had already prepared in advance. And imagine, like, I was just thinking about from Bezalel's viewpoint, like here he had trained all of his life to do this amazing work. Then he was freed and like, oh, well, everybody's a shepherd here for some reason. There's no use for this. And then all of a sudden he's sort of discovered and brought out in front of everyone and go, you're in charge. In fact, it's amazing to think like of, the Bible's a big book, but Bezalel, this guy that you had probably never heard of before, has 3 chapters where it just over and over says like Bezalel made, Bezalel constructed, Bezalel used, Bezalel wove. Over and over and over, you'll find this dozens of times. It just says how, and he wasn't the only one doing this, but he was the leader. Bezalel's using those skills that he gained in Egypt, his mastery, to construct this fantastic thing that was called the tabernacle. He made like gold. In fact, just imagine this, like the poles that they used in the tent, like imagine an easy up with golden poles. That's what they were constructing out there. The altar, he made the altar and covered it with gold. The table that they would use to set the sacrificial bread on and the sacrifice on, the wash basin and all the decoration, the lamps. In fact, I don't know if you've seen the documentary that Dr. Indiana Jones put out, right? He actually made the Ark of the Covenant. You've seen the Ark of the Covenant in that documentary. Bezalel, the guy we've been talking about, he's the one who created this. I mean, it's just amazing, like amazing to think of this guy who was a slave, who created all of these amazing things, and you're thinking this moment, kind of like I was, going, well, good thing he was discovered. Good thing Moses sort of called him out of the crowd. But here's the interesting thing. That's not what happened. Like Bezalel wasn't just sort of randomly picked or discovered. I forgot to tell you earlier, but of all of the things on Bezalel's resume that I find interesting is the fact that God himself gave Bezalel a reference. Now, perhaps you have put God on your reference, on your, it doesn't work very well. They have trouble contacting him. But imagine like God himself gave Bezalel a reference and we have it. That's what's cool. Like sometimes you ask for a reference and you never see it and you hope they did a good job. We actually have the reference that God gave Bezalel, and it doesn't happen in chapter 34 like where we saw the tabernacle being constructed, and we saw all chapters 36 through 39, all the things Bezalel's doing. Way back in chapter 31, back when Moses is on the mountain getting the 10 Commandments, God says this to Moses, and it's pretty remarkable. In chapter 31, 1 through 6, it says, "Then the Lord said to Moses," and this is literally a face-to-face sit-down meeting where Moses came back down the mountain and his face was glowing. They actually asked him to cover up his face because he was freaking everybody out. Moses sits down with God, and God says, "Look, I have specifically chosen Bezalel, son of Uri, grandson of Hur, of the tribe of Judah. And I have filled him with the Spirit of God, giving him great wisdom and ability and expertise in all kinds of crafts. And he's a master craftsman, and he's expert in working with gold and silver and bronze. And he is skilled in engraving and mounting gemstones and in carving wood. He is a master of every craft." I mean, can you imagine God himself is saying this? "And I have personally appointed Aholiab, son of, I don't want to say his name, of the tribe of Dan, to be his assistant. Moreover, I have given special skills to all of the gifted craftsmen so that they can make all the things I have commanded you to make." And then he begins to list the things that they're supposed to make in the tabernacle. Isn't that amazing? And I want you to notice this. Like, he says, I have filled him with the Spirit of God. And it wasn't I filled him with the Spirit of God to be a great leader. I filled him with the Spirit of God to preach sermons. I filled him with the Spirit of God to prophesy. All the things that we think and preachers like and the church sermons are filled with. No, he said that he filled him with the Spirit to make art, to make the most amazing gold-plated construction product that even Donald Trump would be impressed with and go, "That's amazing." I mean, imagine like this guy was gifted by God to do something with his hands. And so work is spiritual, folks. Like we like to think, oh, well, and that it can't happen, that God's not concerned with those things. God specifically said in his reference letter, like, this is what I gifted him with my Spirit for, to make amazing things. And I want you to notice, if you go, well, that was just Bezalel, that's different. No, he said, moreover, I've given special skill to all of the gifted craftsmen so they can make all things. See, God knows our resumes, and God cares about our resumes, and God actually gives us to do the things that we're gifted to do. And see, that's kind of different than the way we think of it most of the time, isn't it? Like, most of the time we go, well, this is my deal, and I just sort of lucked into it, or that's what I went to school for, or nobody ever discovered my great dinosaur picture, so this is what I do. And we sort of feel disconnected from God in that process. And unless we're a preacher or a missionary or like 3 other Christian jobs, we sort of think, well, that's different than church stuff. But this story says that work is spiritual and work matters to God. And God actually pays a lot of attention to it. And I was thinking about our little project here. Like, I had Kate pull this picture. This is what this room, and notice it's open, like, it's been less than 10 months since this looked like this. I mean, remember this if you were here? And I know some of them are new, and I'm so glad you're here and get to see the finished result. But, like, isn't it amazing to think this is what this looked like? And during that process, we learned as a church, like, oh, my goodness, there were so many people who had skills that we had no idea. And thankfully they did, because we couldn't have done this with what we knew. Like, people stepped up and go, I can do this, or who knew I could do this? But there was one thing, and I'm not going to give all the names because I would leave someone out, and you'd go, well, you forgot to mention me. I know that. And we couldn't have done it out without any of you. But I was thinking about Jason, who actually headed up the renovation. And some of you knew that, and some of you saw him do that, and some of you didn't even. But there was, like, when it came time, I remember we were sitting in a meeting. It was on a Thursday night in our small group, and Steve said, oh, by the way, he buried the lead. He goes, oh, by the way, I bought that club, and you guys can have it if you want. And it's exactly the way he said it. And I went, what? You know, that's amazing, because I wasn't even sure what was going to happen at that point. There were so many problems with it. And Jason Vogelsong was sitting across from me at the table, and I realized at that moment, like, that's awesome, but we have a problem, because that's going to be a huge renovation. We don't have a lot of money, and I knew, like, I've had experience in leading renovation projects, but I had 3 jobs already, and there was no way I'd fit that in. And I looked across the table, and it was this quick. I said to Jason, I said, I think you're the guy to lead this. Would you do it? And believe it or not, he was silly enough to say yes right there at the table. Now, here's the thing. You might think, like, I just discovered him. Like, oh, wow. But I've known Jason, and I was thinking about this week. Like, I've known Jason since he was 15. You know, he used to come to my house, and like, I don't even think he was legally driving yet, and he would drive to my house, you know? And it was like, I've known him and Michelle for so many years, and I've seen them develop, and I've seen sort of, like, Jason work this job, and then he started doing sort of some home flipping on the side, and then sort of leave his job to become a full-time entrepreneur and lead crews and lead subcontractors. And all of a sudden, there's this guy, this young man in his 30s, sitting across from me, who's perfectly qualified to lead this renovation. And obviously he did a good job, because you're sitting in it. And we actually came in and paid cash for everything in it, which is just impossible. I think our total in the end was less than $40,000 to do all of this interior, which is just silly. And Jason would be embarrassed to be telling you. I don't tell you that just to go, oh, I gotta make Jason look good. I want to tell you that, like, there are things in your life right now, like, he had no idea that someday he would do this project. And I don't think Bezalel, as he was a slave, had any idea, like, someday I'll create the tabernacle. But during that time, and here's where I kind of want you to think for a moment. Like, we spend so much of our lives waiting to be discovered. And you might not sit around, you're not sitting at home, I know you're working, but you're like, I wish someone would notice. I wish someone would notice, like, that I'm really good at this, or you have this dream, or you had this dream, and you've let it go, and you're kind of like, I wish someone would discover me, and I wish they would notice, like, I'm fit for something better than this. But the truth is, God doesn't discover people. God never discovers people, because he can't, because he knows everything. But when I read the story of Bezalel, it's so clear that God develops people. Like, all of the things that Bezalel was doing when he was an apprentice, when he was a slave, that was important. And see, I think right now, I was thinking about this, like, as I watched Jason grow up, because I'm an old man, I got to see that happen. And so when the time came that I had a project of this size, and he's sitting across, and God literally put him straight across the table for me, and I was able to go, you're ready for this. because I had seen him develop into the guy that could handle that. And God does that all the time, and he knows all about it. But here's the thing I want you to think about this morning. I think we spend a lot of our life waiting to be discovered, which makes us think like what I'm doing now is not that important, this job I'm working or this career, but someday there's something better. But truth is, maybe you're being developed right now and you're missing it, because that would make everything important. And I want the guys to come up and sing another song. Their music's been perfect for today. Nothing like some good Detroit rock and roll for a series about work. But I want to pray with you. And I want to challenge you to go, what if you stopped waiting to be discovered and you sort of went about the business of being developed, of working really hard at what you have in front of you now, of trying to be the best at what God is giving to you to do now. And if you're a follower of Christ this morning, sort of trusting that God knows. He knows your resume and he knows what you could do. And I want to tell you one more thing, one more story, because I don't want you to think this is about like you working for the church, because I've done the preacher thing. Even in that story, and it was a good story I had to share with you about Jason, it still ended up with him working for the church. And you're thinking, yeah, this is all about getting more volunteer. No. I don't even think it's about that. In fact, I know it's not, because about 18 years ago, I wasn't a painting contractor yet. I was just a contractor, and I got a job. I would take anything at that point. Like, I don't even care if it paid. I got a job retrofitting a bunch of apartments with handicapped accessible stuff, which furthest thing from my mind. It wasn't something I was interested in. It was just something I did. So I think I did about 19 apartments with handicap bars and grab rails and retrofitted them so that they would be handicap accessible. Never thought about it again. The check cleared and I moved on with my life. Well, later, a few years ago, when my father-in-law had ALS, that became actually really helpful. Is that just remembering that and knowing how to do that and kind of knowing where things were, and a couple tricks I learned in that project actually proved very helpful as we set up our house and his house later to become handicap accessible. Now, 2 weeks ago, my mom, she was here just a few weeks before that, had a massive stroke. And so she lived through it, and she is recovering, but she's basically paralyzed down one side at this point. And so next weekend, she's coming home in Missouri to their home. And my thought was, I was praying about, like, what could I do to help? And I realized, like, oh, my goodness, Don, you could go put handicap accessible bars up everywhere in their house, and your brothers and sisters are doing an amazing thing. My brother and sister are mostly in the medical field, so they're doing the real stuff. But like, I was like, that's something I could do because of this job, because of this experience, because of my resume, if you will. And so the reason why I tell you this is next weekend, I'm not going to be here. Matt is going to I've already heard his sermon or the outline, and it's going to be amazing. And I want you to listen to Matt next week, and you should be here because Matt actually knows more about this resume process than I do, because he hires people all the time. But Matt Burr has got a great sermon to share with you. And you know what? I feel like my ministry next week is I'm going to go to Missouri. I'm going to hang some handicap bars. I'm going to prepare the house for my mom, because I think that's the way it works. And I think God uses our resumes. He knows our resumes, and he's not as interested as we think in discovering us. He never discovers people. He develops them. And so I just want to pray with you and go, what if you just stop trying to wait to be discovered and be developed? Dear Jesus, we love you, and we're so thankful that you know us, and you know our deepest, darkest secrets and the things we're ashamed of. But God, you also know like the amazing abilities that you've put inside of us. And God, I'm looking out over this crowd, and I'm going, man, think of the possibilities, but I don't know them enough to go, wow, I know what that person could do. But the amazing thing is I know you do. So God, I just pray that we'd become a church a church of people who didn't sort of disconnect our occupation from our salvation. And God, I pray that we would stop just waiting to be discovered and begin to be developed by you, and understand how much our resume matters to you and how much our day-to-day lives do. And God, we thank you for this scripture. In your name we pray, amen.